Students, friends, colleagues, faculty, staff, and administrators from SUNY Ulster and elsewhere, welcome to the 2018 Ellen Robbins Poetry Forum. I'm the Department Chair of the English, Foreign Language, and Philosophy departments here at SUNY Ulster. First of all, we'd like to extend our thanks to the Robbins family, Ellen Robbins, former chair of our department, and the SUNY Ulster Foundation for their continued support of the forum. The format today is going to consist of first a reading, and followed by an interview, and then there will be a time at the end for audience Q&A, so you can look forward to that. Our moderator today is Professor Dolores Quiles, Director of ELS. Professor Quiles continues to have a distinguished career here at SUNY Ulster, having served for 27 years and counting. Our guest today hails originally from Brooklyn, New York. He studied law and history and has spent time as a tenant lawyer in Boston. He has published almost 20 books as a poet, editor, essayist, and translator. His latest collection of poems is called Vivas to Those Who Have Failed. Other books of poems include The Trouble Ball, A Mayan Astronomer, and Hell's Kitchen. Rebellion is the Circle of a Lover's Hands. Now he teaches poetry at UMass Amherst. Please, everyone, give a warm welcome to Martín Espada.
Buenos días. Good morning. Thank you all for being here. Thank you all for being here so early. I am not used to this. I am a poet. I am nocturnal. I don't have a pulse before noon. But here I am, and here you are, so let's do this thing. Thank you very much, SUNY Ulster. Thanks to everyone who organized this event and provided the funding, of course. I'm going to be reading from 3 of my books, and then we will, as you heard, do an onstage interview, me and Professor Quiles, followed by a Q&A where you can ask anything you want, and then finally there'll be a book signing over there to our left, my left, so that's important too. If you brought your own books, I will be happy to sign those as well. So let's begin. As you might imagine, Puerto Rico has very much been on my mind. That is the place where my father, Frank Espada, was born in 1930. As you walked in, you saw his photographs flashed on the screen. More about that later. Of course, I've also been thinking about Puerto Rico because of Hurricane Maria and the aftermath of Hurricane Maria. I've been thinking about the resiliency of the people, how they have survived this and many other hurricanes. This is not the first hurricane, and I have more to say about that too, what I mean by the word hurricane. But this goes back centuries, really. And I'd like to start us off with a poem about the music of Puerto Rico, especially the music brought by the slaves from West Africa with their religion, which survived every attempt by the Spanish to stamp it out and is now an essential part of Puerto Rican culture and identity. Well, if you go to Puerto Rico, if you go to Viejo San Juan, the old city, you'll find a street there called Calle San Sebastián, St. Sebastian Street, a street famous for its music. There's a big festival there, and all year long you can hear this music coming from the street, the clubs, the bars. Much of it music that came originally from the slaves and their religion from West Africa. So for me, San Sebastian is a street of miracles, a street where the impossible can happen, even the end of war, even the return of the dead, even the survival of a hurricane. There's a very simple Spanish refrain in this poem, en la calle San Sebastián, on St. Sebastian Street. So I hope you can hear the music in the words. I hope you can also hear the resiliency of the people in these words. And this is where we will begin. En la calle San Sebastián, Viejo San Juan, Puerto Rico. Here in a bar on the street of the Saint, in la calle San Sebastián, a dancer in white with a red scarf in la calle San Sebastián calls to the gods who were freed by slaves in la calle San Sebastián. And his bronze face is a lantern of sweat in la calle San Sebastián. And hands smack congas like flies in the field in la calle San Sebastián. And remember the beat of packing crates in la calle San Sebastián. From the days when overseers banished the drum in la calle San Sebastián. And trumpets screech like parrots of gold in la calle San Sebastián. Trumpets that herald the end of the war in la calle San Sebastián, as soldiers toss rifles on cobblestone in la calle San Sebastián. And the saint himself snaps an arrow in half in la calle San Sebastián. Then lost grandfathers and fathers appear in la calle San Sebastián, fingers tugging my steel wool beard in la calle San Sebastián, whispering, your beard is gray in la calle San Sebastián, spilling their rum across the table in la calle San Sebastián, till cousins lead them away to bed in la calle San Sebastián. And the dancer in white with the face of bronze in la calle San Sebastián shakes rain from his hair like the god of storms in la calle San Sebastián, and sings with the blood that drums in the chest in la calle San Sebastián, and praises the blood that beats in the hands in la calle San Sebastián and la calle San Sebastián. Well, I am from the tropical paradise of Brooklyn, New York. Yeah. I'm from the East New York section of Brooklyn, if you know Brooklyn. I'm from the Linden Projects, if you know East New York. All right? It's not nice Brooklyn, it's the other Brooklyn. And when I was a kid growing up, I kept hearing about this paradise called Puerto Rico. And I went there for the first time when I was 11 years old. Been back many times since, but that first visit is always unique and important, no matter where your family is from, where you're from. When I got there, I saw something very strange. I didn't understand it then. I think I understand it now. You know, Puerto Rico is a colony of the United States, has been since the Spanish-American War of 1898. And one of the byproducts of colonialism, of one country owned and operated by another, is a colonized mind, right? Sort of national inferiority complex. And it came out in what my family were eating and drinking. And so this is my poem that came out of that experience. I call it my cultural imperialism and vacation poem, Coca-Cola and Coco Frio. On his first visit to Puerto Rico, island of family folklore, the fat boy wandered from table to table with his mouth open. At every table, some great aunt would steer him with cool spotted hands to a glass of Coca-Cola. One even sang to him in all the English he could remember a Coca-Cola jingle from the 40s. He drank obediently, though he was bored with this potion familiar from soda fountains in Brooklyn. Then, at a roadside stand off the beach, the fat boy opened his mouth to Coco Frio, a coconut chilled and scalped by a machete so that a straw could inhale the clear milk. The boy tilted the green shell overhead and drooled coconut milk down his chin. Suddenly, Puerto Rico was not Coca-Cola or Brooklyn, and neither was he. For years afterward, the boy marveled at an island where the people drank Coca-Cola and sang jingles from World War II in a language they did not speak, while so many coconuts in the trees sagged, heavy with milk, swollen and unsuckled. So you might wonder, how does a poet come out of the projects of Brooklyn? And I had role models. I met my first poet in Brooklyn. He was a visitor from a strange planet called East Harlem. His name was Jack Agüeros. Jack Agüeros was indeed a poet. He was many things. He was also a translator. He was an essayist. He was a playwright. He was a fiction writer. He was a community organizer. He was the director of something called El Museo del Barrio, the only Puerto Rican museum in the United States at that time. And he was a running buddy of my father's. He would become my second father. We would become very close. He was something of a visionary. Every Dia de Reyes, every Three Kings Day in January 6th, Jack would lead a parade of camels and sheep through the snow of East Harlem. That's who he was. So when Jack, who was much beloved, was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, a bunch of us organized something for him. We organized a benefit to defray his medical expenses, and we held this benefit in the very school building where he had been a student in East Harlem many, many years ago. This is the poem I wrote for the occasion, and there's a little bit of Spanish in here. Jack, he had a favorite phrase, and you're going to hear me refer to cuchifritos, which is like Puerto Rican fried stuff, and also use this all-purpose word, bendito, right? Which, depending on the context, can be like 10 different things, but you'll get it. Literally means blessed. So, Jack told the truth. And that's why this poem is called Blessed Be the Truth Tellers for Jack Agüeros. In the projects of Brooklyn, everyone lied. My mother used to say, if somebody starts a fight, just walk away. Then somebody would smack the back of my head and dance around me in a circle, laughing. When I was 12, pus bubbled on my tonsils, and everyone said, after the operation, you can have all the ice cream you want. I bragged about the deal. No longer would I chase the ice cream truck down the street, panting at the bells to catch Johnny, the ice cream man, who allegedly sold heroin the color of vanilla from the same window. Then, Jack, the truth teller, visited the projects. Jack, who herded real camels and sheep through the snow of East Harlem every Three Kings Day. Jack, who wrote sonnets of the jail cell and the racetrack and the boxing ring. Jack, who crossed his arms in a hunger strike until the mayor hired more Puerto Ricans. And Jack said, "You're gonna get your tonsils out? Ay, bendito cuchifrito, Puerto Rico, that's gonna hurt." I was etherized, then woke up on the ward, heaving black water onto white sheets. A man poking through his hospital gown leaned over me and sneered, "You think you got it tough? Look at this," and showed me the cauliflower tumor behind his ear. I heaved up black water again. The ice cream burned. Vanilla was a snowball spiked with bits of glass. My throat was red as a tunnel on fire after the head-on collision of two gasoline trucks. This is how I learned to trust the poets and shepherds of East Harlem. Blessed be the truth tellers, for they shall have all the ice cream they want. Every Puerto Rican poet has to have a cockroach poem. What? It's true. When I was a kid growing up in Brooklyn in the 60s, everybody thought we brought the cockroaches with us. Like we're getting on the plane of San Juan with these great big jars of live roaches, shaking them out in the streets of New York. Go, my children, you're free. Right? And I want to edit a great big coffee table book, photographs, poems, all about cockroaches. Call it La Cucaracha. And this is going to be my contribution. That's one of the things you can do. If the editor, you put your own poems in there. This is called My Cockroach Lover. The summer I slept on JC's couch. There were roaches between the bristles of my toothbrush. Roaches pouring from the speakers of the stereo. A light flipped on in the kitchen at night revealed a Republican National Convention of roaches. An Indianapolis 500 of roaches. One night, I dreamed a giant roach leaned over me, brushing my face with kind antenna and whispering, "I love you." I awoke slapping myself and watched the darkness for hours because I realized this was a dream, and so that meant the cockroach did not really love me. That's it. It's like Perry Thomas used to say, boom, boom. Well, as I mentioned before, as you were walking in and sitting down, you saw some photographs flashed on that screen to my right. Those are photographs taken by my father, Frank Espada. Who I mentioned was born on the island of Puerto Rico in 1930, migrated to this country, to New York City, and who ultimately created something called the Puerto Rican Diaspora Documentary Project, a photo documentary of the Puerto Rican migration all over the United States and even back to Puerto Rico. So it was first. No one had ever done that before. And there were many people who told him he couldn't do it. One of them was a famous photographer in his own right, a man named Cornell Kappa. It was Cornell Kappa who said to my father, "No one wants to look at pictures of Puerto Ricans, Frank." My father used that statement as motivation. You know, your parents will tell you the same story over and over again, and you're supposed to pretend you never heard it before. My father would do that with Cornell Kappa. He would say, "Yeah, Cornell Kappa, you know what he said to me? Huh? You know what he said to me?" "No, what?" "No one wants to look at pictures of Puerto Ricans, Frank." Well, those pictures are now included in the collections of the Smithsonian Museum of American History, the Smithsonian Museum of American Art, the National Portrait Gallery, the Library of Congress, and the Booth Center for Documentary Studies. So, of course, I wanted to write a poem about my father, the photographer. My father died in 2014, so it's been 4 years. I wrote a series of 10 poems about him when he died. This was one of them. About my father, the photographer, the artist, activist, because that's what he was doing. It was all about justice in his community. And so, in this next poem, I refer to many of the images you saw on that screen. As a matter of fact, I even refer to the image on the cover of this book. Let's get clear about one thing, that's not my father. Lots of people say, oh, your father smoked cigars. No, he didn't. That was not my father. This is a photograph taken by my father of a union organizer by the name of Edelmiro Huertas. Organized the furniture factories in San Francisco in the 1930s. He appears in this poem. So do others. So does Jack Agüeros, my father's friend and one of his favorite subjects. It begins with something that happened right after my father died. It's called Mad Love. Mad Love comes from a really crazy, strange, weird, terrible horror movie with Peter Lorre in 1934. It's awful. You have to see it. So here we go. Mad Love. And this one comes with an epigraph, you know, it's this sort of a statement or a quote that follows the title of a poem. So it's called Mad Love. And I bet you can guess what the epigraph is. No one wants to look at pictures of Puerto Ricans, Frank. Cornell Capital. My brother said, they harvested his corneas. I imagined the tweezers lifting the corneas from my father's eyes, delicate as the wings of butterflies mounted under glass. I imagined the transplant, stitches finer than hair, eyes fluttering awake to the brilliance of an open window. This is not a horror movie. This is not Peter Lorre in Mad Love, the insane and jealous surgeon grafting the hands of a killer onto the forearms of a concert pianist who fumbles with the keys of the piano, flings knives with lethal aim, moonlight sonata swept away by lust for homicide, his wife shrieking. The blind will see, like the captain of the slave ship who turned the ship around. Voices in the room will praise the Lord for the miracle, yet the eyes drinking light through my father's eyes will not see the faces in the lens of his camera. Faces of the faceless waking in the darkroom. Not the tomato picker with a picket sign on his shoulder that says, Reagan steals from the poor and gives to the rich. Not the fry cook in his fedora staring at air as if he knew he would be stomped to death on the stoop for an empty wallet. Not the poet in a beret grinning at the vision of shoes for all the shoeless people on the earth. Not the dancer hearing the piano tell her to spin and spin again. Not the grave digger and his machete, the bandana that keeps the dust of the dead from coating his tongue. Not the union organizer's spirits floating in the smoke of his victory cigar. Not the addict in rehab gazing at herself like a fortune teller gazing at the cards. Not the face half hidden by the star in the Puerto Rican flag, the darkness of his dissident's eye. Now that my father cannot speak, they wait their turn to testify in his defense, witnesses to the mad love that drove him to it. Okay, and I would like to finish this segment with one more poem. And this is a poem ultimately about immigrants and immigration. I think it's very important to talk about that these days, given the backlash against immigrants and immigration in this country. To humanize the dehumanized, give them eyes, nose, face. This is a 9/11 poem, but it's a 9/11 poem with a twist. The focus is on the food service workers who were killed that day. Most of them immigrant, and many of them undocumented, invisible in life, and even more invisible in death, which is why I wrote the poem. The word alabanza means praise in Spanish, and the title of the poem also refers to the labor union to which these workers belonged. There are other references in the poem that you may or may not get. Oye is a way of saying, hey, you know, Fajardo is a port city in Puerto Rico where I had family. Roberto Clemente, of course, the great baseball player who died tragically delivering relief supplies to earthquake victims in Nicaragua. Anyway, and you probably know the rest of the story about September the 11th. So here is the poem. I'll close my reading with this. It's called Alabanza in Praise of Local 100 for the 43 members of hotel employees and restaurant employees, Local 100, working at the Windows in the World restaurant who lost their lives in the attack on the World Trade Center. And I'll finish my reading with this. Alabanza. Praise the cook with a shaven head and a tattoo on his shoulder that said, Oye. A blue-eyed Puerto Rican with people from Fajardo, a harbor of pirates centuries ago. Praise the lighthouse in Fajardo, candle glimmering white to worship the dark saint of the sea, Alabanza. Praise the cook's yellow pirate's cap, worn in the name of Roberto Clemente, his plane that flamed into the ocean loaded with cans for Nicaragua, for all the mouths chewing the ash of earthquakes, Alabanza. Praise the kitchen radio, dial clicked even before the dial on the oven, so that music and Spanish rose before bread. Praise the bread, Alabanza. Praise Manhattan from 107 flights up, like Atlantis glimpsed through the windows of an ancient aquarium. Praise the great windows where immigrants from the kitchen could squint and almost see their world, hear the chant of nations. Ecuador, Mexico, República Dominicana, Haiti, Yemen, Ghana, Bangladesh, Alabanza. Praise the kitchen in the morning where the gas burned blue on every stove and exhaust fans fired their diminutive propellers. Hands cracked eggs with quick thumbs or sliced open cartons to build an altar of cans. Alabanza. Praise the busboy's music, the chime of his dishes and silverware in the tub. Alabanza. Praise the dish dog, the dishwasher who worked that morning because another dishwasher could not stop coughing, or because he needed overtime to pile the sacks of rice and beans for a family floating away on some Caribbean island plagued by frogs. Alabanza. Praise the waitress who heard the radio in the kitchen and sang to herself about a man gone. Alabanza. After the thunder, wilder than thunder. After the shudder deep in the glass of the great windows. After the radio stopped singing like a tree full of terrified frogs. After night burst the dam of day and flooded the kitchen. For a time the stoves glowed in darkness like the lighthouse in Fajardo, like a cook's soul. Soul, I say. Even if the dead cannot tell us about the bristles of God's beard, because God has no face. Soul, I say, to name the smoke beings flung in constellations across the night sky of this city and cities to come. Alabanza, I say, even if God has no face. Alabanza. When the war began, from Manhattan and Kabul, 2 constellations of smoke rose and drifted to each other, mingling in icy air, and one said with an Afghan tongue, "Teach me to dance, we have no music here." And the other said with a Spanish tongue, "I will teach you, music is all we have." Muchas gracias, thank you very much.
say as well. Your poems are a daily testament to what's going on in our culture right now. We have 5 centuries of Latin writers, Latino writers, yet our voices each time seem to be suppressed and oppressed, and your poems speak to that. When did you first start finding your voice?
Well, I was 15 years old when I wrote my first poem. And I have to preface this by saying that I was a terrible student. I failed English in the 8th grade. And now I am a professor of English. Which only demonstrates the way your life can go, you know, zigs and zags. And so by the 10th grade, I was simply trying not to be seen in the classroom. I sat at the back with the other young thugs. And one day our English teacher, his name was Mr. Valeka, I don't remember his first name, Mr., came up to us and he said, "Young thugs, I have an assignment for you." And he held up a magazine. He said, "This is the New Yorker magazine." And we had never seen the New Yorker magazine. I mean, this was a very different New York. He said, "Here's what I want you to do. I want you to make your own edition, your own version of the New Yorker magazine. See, it's got different sections. Everybody takes a section. You make your own New Yorker magazine. Okay? Go." And so the magazine was passed hand to hand down the hierarchy of thuggery until it came to me. It's at the bottom of the food chain again. And the only thing left at the back of the magazine was a poem. And I was very upset. I thought, oh man, a poem. But, you know, I didn't want to fail English again. So I sat by the window that day. It was raining outside. So I wrote a poem about rain. I don't have the poem anymore. I did not know it would be historic. And I remember only one line. Tiny silver hammers pounding the earth to describe rain. I had just invented my first metaphor. I did not know what a metaphor was. And then someone told me, and I went strutting down the hallway. I made a metaphor. How bad. But I learned something else that day. I learned that I love words. I learned that I love words. I love banging words into each other, watching them spin around the room, and maybe fly out the window with the rain. And almost in the beginning, I was writing about the same subjects, the same themes that I write about today. I was writing about friends and family and community, and society and self. And that's where it began. And here's the punchline. Many years later, I was finally published in the pages of the New Yorker magazine.
Wow. Excellent. Excellent. So you talk a lot about, you know, how we need to say our voice, to speak up because nobody wants to hear us for so many years. And you talk about the art, the act of writing and what does it teach you. And I teach English 101 here on campus, and I tell my students, what is your purpose in writing? When you write an essay, what is your purpose other than I'm assigning you an essay and you have to write an essay by next week? And so that's what I want you to talk about. What does it teach us? What can the art of writing teach us?
Well, obviously, it can teach us, first it can teach us about ourselves. I think whether we're writing about ourselves or writing about others, you know, we are learning about ourselves. But we can also be the teachers.
Exactly.
You know, we don't often enough think of ourselves in that way, but everyone here in this room knows something the rest of us don't know. And so when I write, and I've said this before in an essay, I write for those who do not know and those who do. Right? So I'm writing the poems you heard for those who don't know of the history or the conditions in the community, the tragedies or the triumphs. But then I'm writing for those who do know but don't have the opportunity that I have to express it. They don't have a platform. They don't publish books. They don't have a website. They don't do public readings and so on. So I think of myself as an advocate in that way. And that's very natural for me because I practiced law, got a law degree and all that. And no, it did not ruin my mind. You can be a poet and a lawyer. And just parenthetically, the media discovered me at that point. They said, oh my God, the poet lawyer. You know, like a creature out of Greek mythology or something. Body of a lawyer and the head of a poet, you know, running out of the woods. You know, but in both cases, I was and I continue to be an advocate, speaking on behalf of those without an opportunity to be heard. And we've now reached a crisis in this country in terms of silence. You know, because more people, even though more people are more vocal than ever, more people are also more silent than ever. You know, I think of the tens of millions of people in this country, Latinos, Latinas, Latinx, and you would not know it. If a Martian came down tomorrow and turned on the television or started reading the literary journals, whatever it was, that Martian would not know how many Latinos there are in this country and what we're doing. You know, we're still dealing with, amazingly, we're dealing with invisibility. So yes, I try to make the invisible visible in my work.
So talking about the invisible, as I knew you were coming and I would be here speaking to you, and I'm very honored speaking to you because as one fellow Nuyorican to another. And I asked my students, what does it mean to be Nuyorican? What is Nuyorican? And they were like, I don't know, a combination of New York, Puerto Rican. What does it mean to you? I know you're not only a Nuyorican writer, but you are a Nuyorican. And what does Nuyorican mean?
Well, most literally, Nuyorican refers to Puerto Rican born and or raised in New York City. And there are variations on that. So as I travel around the country, I have discovered them. So in Philadelphia, a Puerto Rican born in Philadelphia would be called a Philarican. And someone who's a product of a Puerto Rican parent and a Mexican parent, of course, would be a Mexarican. And so on. And all those words, all those phrases just sort of demonstrate this multiracial, multicultural consciousness, which was there long before it was popular or was studied in textbooks. You know, it was, you know, I'm multiracial, and most Puerto Ricans are. We are the product of three different races, with the you know, three different peoples, shall we say, you know. The Spanish conquistadores, and then the Africans brought as slaves, and the original indigenous inhabitants of the island, who call they call themselves Boricuas or Borican, and came to be known eventually as Taínos. And so that to me is, you know, all that goes into Nuyorican. It's not a term you hear very much anymore, though. And I think it's important to remember this with any and all umbrella terminology. It's just there for the rain. You know, it's temporary. And in a generation, we might be calling ourselves something else.
Well, it seems like a constant mutation, what's going on, and it's just not a play on words. Does it bring us closer to our island, or does it separate us even more?
Well, we're separated from the island physically, but we're also separated by another phenomenon. Puerto Ricans are separated from each other by virtue of colonialism.
Right.
And we don't talk about that very much in this country because, according to traditional history, the United States is not an imperial power. And it's only the imperial powers who have colonies. Well, Puerto Rico, as I said before, has been a colony of the United States since 1898, the Spanish-American War. And the status has not changed. And sometimes colonialism is there right under the surface. And one of the basic principles of colonialism is divide and rule. So we're constantly divided against each other as Puerto Ricans. We're divided by language, we're divided by geography, we're divided by, it's like the crabs in the bucket thing. But then sometimes we come together, and that's important. You know, we were talking about my father, we were talking about Jack Agüeros. You've heard of something called the Greatest Generation in reference to World War II, usually refers to white men who fought during the Second World War. Well, Puerto Ricans had the greatest generation of their own. Well, that was the Puerto Rican community of the 1960s, where there were people like my father, like Frank Espada, like Jack Agüeros, like Evelina Antonetti of United Bronx Parents, like your father, who were in the streets, who were marching, who were getting arrested or going to jail, getting out, making more noise, who were getting into the corridors of power, who were fighting for civil rights, who made the changes that we benefit from. We stand on their shoulders, and we too often forget about that. And those struggles are perpetual. Those struggles go on and on and on. We win, and then we lose the same territory. You know, now we've had these great hurricanes in Puerto Rico. And, you know, like I said before, that's not a first hurricane. Colonialism is a hurricane.
Well, in fact, you said colonialism is a hurricane, economic exploitation is a hurricane, Donald Trump is a hurricane.
Yes, Donald Trump is a hurricane.
And, you know, now, as you say, Puerto Ricans, we have this double attachment, this double loyalty, because the prosperity that it brought to the island, but it is a prosperity, and I think we're coming, how much more time do we have?
I want to leave some time for questions.
Okay, what now for Puerto Rico? Esmeralda Santiago says, we can't choose our destiny if we are not allowed to solve our problems. We know that Puerto Rico doesn't have control over its borders. We can't trade with anyone. Anything that we import, which is 95% of the imports are from outside, they're double taxed because of the system. So what now for Puerto Rico?
Well, this is obviously a critical moment in the history of Puerto Rico. When Trump showed up only to toss paper towels.
6 hours he was there, that's it.
All right, when he showed up to do that, and I wrote a poem where he makes an appearance tossing paper towels, and I refer to him as Zeus tossing thunderbolts on the locked ward of his delusions. When FEMA did not show up, when, only a fraction of the government supplied meals did not show up, when the tarps didn't show up, and the medicine didn't show up, Puerto Ricans took matters into their own hands. You may have heard references to brigadas, or work brigades, that organized themselves and then went out and with machetes and shovels cleared the roads that nobody else was clearing. You may have heard of grassroots organizations like Comedores Sociales in Puerto Rico who were feeding people. There's soup kitchens, or better put, community kitchens, because they're based on the principle of barter. Puerto Ricans now organize themselves at a grassroots level, and they want a different kind of society. And they're going to do battle with the people who own the island. They're trying to privatize it with the vulture hedge funds. They're trying to claim the debt they say they're still owed, more than $70 billion, with the people who are buying it up. But the fact of the matter remains that Puerto Ricans want a new way, they want a new world. And one way or the other, we're going to get it. This is, if history shows anything, it shows us that history moves from below, and that the impossible is possible, the unthinkable is thinkable. And that's why we have poets to walk around to say those things out loud.
Well, I'll end with this. He says, poetry took me to places I never would have gone but for poetry. I try to write my way out, honor the hunger for meaning by feeding it.
Did I say that?
I'm quoting you from one of your interviews.
I must have said it. Well, that's true. I mean, on a literal level, it's taken me to places I never would have been. From the top of society's ladder to the bottom and back up again. I've done readings every place you could possibly imagine. My first poetry reading was in the same bar where I was the bouncer. Hey, listen up. I did a reading at a boxing gym in Willimantic, Connecticut, for a team of young amateur boxers, mostly Puerto Rican. I did a reading at a tortilla factory, El Matador Tortilla Factory in Grand Rapids, Michigan. I once did a reading at the Coney Island Aquarium but for the jellyfish. And I've read in London, in Queen Elizabeth Hall. I've read at the Kennedy Center, and so on. Not to belabor that point. And yes, I'm out there because of the great hunger, the hunger that I feel, but also the hunger people have in this society today for meaning. We crave meaning. In an age of euphemism and hyper-euphemism, when we hear terms like alt-right and they actually mean something, we except they don't. They're euphemisms, hyper-euphemisms. We crave meaning. And that's why, as a poet, I'm called upon often to perform the same function that preachers do. I do a lot of, I'm available for weddings.
Bar mitzvahs too?
Bar mitzvahs. I do memorial services. I once did 6 in 12 months. Because people crave meaning, especially in circumstances where we are looking into the void, looking at something that appears to be meaningless. Tell us what it means. And that's my job.
And so, any last minute sage advice for our poets now, our writers, our students who are struggling with these complex, with the media who's telling us this is how we should be, and we're saying, no, we don't want to be that way. What are we going to do?
Well, I mean, there's so much advice bouncing around in my head. One would be, don't stay in the motel where I stayed last night. I mean, just obviously, if anything, I mean, this is the time not only to speak. We now have lots of platforms. We're speaking all the time. This is the time to organize. Number one, organize yourselves. Number two, build coalitions. Right? It's necessary but not sufficient to stake out your own identity and your own claim. You have to build bridges with other communities, with other people. Build coalitions. That was something my father was very big on as an organizer. Go out there and change the world, because you're the only one who's going to do it. It's not going to come from the White House. It's going to come from your house. And for God's sake, vote in the next election.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So we're open to questions from the audience. Please, if you have a question for Martin Espada.
Okay, you're going to have to speak up because
How many poetry readings have you done over the years?
conservatively, a couple thousand. Yeah, I mean, there have been some years, it got out of hand. I know there were some years where I did more than 100. and you know, I was bouncing around all over the place. It's not the healthiest lifestyle in the world. It's kind of like a musician's lifestyle. You know, you're on the road a lot. Think Woodstock.
What's your favorite place that you've been?
Wow, there's so many. You know, I've visited any number of countries, and you know, I've read everywhere. So it's hard to identify any one place. I've had some absolutely amazing experiences, including situations that at first looked disastrous. You know, I showed up once to do a reading at a state school in California, and the room is completely empty. Congratulations, by the way, on filling the room. I like that. But it was empty. There was literally no one there, just me and the professor. And you said, wait here. And where's she going? And you know, I know if I don't read, I don't get paid, so I stuck around. And then, you know, and I was there to read for, you know, a Latino student group, but there had been some mix-up, and they thought it was on another day. So they weren't there at all. And then 15 minutes later, while I was, you know, in marched a group of about 15 Asian students. The professor found them on another floor of the building and convinced them to come hear me. And I said, with all due respect, who are you? And there was a tall kid in the basketball letter jacket. And he said, we are the Cambodian Laotian Student Association. I said, oh, so with all due respect, what are you doing here? And she said, well, you know, the professor came upstairs, we were having our monthly meeting, and she said, you're really good. So, you know, read to us. And I said, okay. And he said, but the Laker game is on in 15 minutes. We're all going to the bar to watch it. So I had 15 minutes. And I looked down at my list, and here I had all these poems about immigrants and immigration. Okay, I was going to read them to Mexican American kids, now I'm going to read them to Asian kids. It worked. And I got to the end, and my last poem was a poem insulting the governor of California. They loved it. And they said, yay! And I said, go Lakers! And they said, yay! And they got up and left. And you know, the lesson I took away from that is, you know, poetry can speak to anybody. You really can speak to anybody at any time. And I've learned that, you know, many times. I've done a lot of readings in prisons. A lot of readings in prisons and jails. And that's so important because of the epidemic of incarceration in this country. Because prison is the greatest repository of wasted talent we have in this society. Because per capita, and I can say this, I believe there are more poets in the prison system than in the educational system. They have a lot to say and they have a lot of time on their hands. And every reading I've ever done in a prison has turned into a revival meeting. Because it starts with me reading my poems to them, then they read their poems to me, they're laughing, they're crying, slapping each other on the back. And it changes them, but it also changes me. When I do something like that, I'm giving something, but I'm giving back even more. So those are some of my favorite readings for sure.
Hi, I brought my creative writing class here. We do a lot of free writing practice. Can you speak to the importance of free writing, or maybe your practice, daily practice of writing, and how poems surface there?
Well, I wish I could tell you that I write every day. I don't. I know that's sacrilegious. And I know, you know, this is a regular writing series. I know you have another writing series here this year. And I know there are going to be writers that come to you and you may ask the same question and you're going to hear an answer that sounds something like this. Well, I get up every morning at 5 a.m. and I milk the dog and I sit down and I write for 7 hours straight, and I do that every single day, and if you don't do that, you're not a writer. Well, anyone who feeds you that line is leaving something out. Somebody else is taking care of that person. Somebody else is doing the cooking. Somebody else is doing the cleaning. Somebody else is doing the driving. Somebody else is taking care of the kids. Somebody else is writing out the checks. Somebody else is doing the food shopping. And so on and so forth. In other words, someone is taking care of that person. Most of us are or will be caretakers. We take care of our kids, or we take care of our parents, or whatever it is. Most of us are caretakers. We don't have the luxury of sitting there writing every day for 7 hours. So we have to become time bandits. We have to steal time and energy away from everything else. Because there's no price tag on a poem, and we live in a mercantile culture. We're expected to do something of value and trade in immediately for goods and services. The practice of writing every day is a luxury. So I write in my head. The free writing you're talking about, it takes place in my head. And then I have to be able to remember what it is that I have written in my head until I have the opportunity to set it down on paper as a draft in some form or another. And then revision, because, yes, writing is rewriting, which you've already rewritten. Sorry to give you the news.
Thank you.
And that's absolutely critically important. But I don't simply begin with sounds in my head. I often have a story to tell. As you heard from the reading, I am a narrative poet. I tell stories. And I will set out to tell a story, and sometimes it has a beginning and a middle and an end, and sometimes it doesn't. It doesn't have to be linear. But that's difficult. That's like making a pool shot from across the table. And yet, with enough practice, you can do that. And that's what I do. I have a story, I set out to tell it. I tell the stories, though, through the image, through the five senses. It must be grounded in the image, or it isn't the poem that I want it to be. Right? So that's all the language you heard is grounded in metaphor and simile, grounded in the image. Because it has to be good poetry, too. It's not enough to tell a good story. It has to be a good poem, too.
We have time for one more question. Okay.
Me? Oh,
Yep.
Hi. Okay. So if you could choose, like, which piece of poetry is your favorite one, like that you've written? If you could choose.
Oh, well, I'm like a bad parent. I think my favorite poem is the last one I wrote. I suppose I should be paying attention to which poem is getting good grades in school, which poem never gets into trouble, which poem is polite to its elders. I don't know. But it's very subjective, it's very arbitrary, and it changes from day to day.
Yeah.
And I don't yell at any of my poems, but I'm not insane. The last poem I wrote was a poem about the hurricanes in Puerto Rico. It's called Letter to My Father. And, I'd read it now except it's a long poem. And it's, it was generated by the practice of speaking to my father. My father's 4 years gone, but I still have his ethereal remains. I have his ashes in a box wrapped in a Puerto Rican flag on my bookshelf, And I started talking to him. And particularly because he was born in a little mountain town called Utuado. And Utuado was utterly devastated in the hurricane. It was the epicenter of the hurricane. And I began speaking to him as if he were there but not there, as if he could hear me, but he didn't know what was happening on the island. And so I had to tell him you know. And parenthetically, you've seen images from the island, from the, images of the hurricane. If you have, you've seen Utuado. You've been reading articles about the hurricane. If you have, you've been reading about Utuado. It was that bad. And so I decided I had to write this poem again for those who do not know and those who do. Not just about the devastation. It's not just a lamentation, but it's also about the place that I discovered and the place that will rise again, because it will. And by the end of that poem, I make a promise to my father, and I say, I'm going to bring your ashes back there. I'm going to scatter your ashes in the cloud, and so now, having written it, I have to do it.
Well, I think time is up now.
Well, thank you very much.